Let's turn to a clip from a CNN interview on Sunday morning with Yasser Louati from the Collective Against Islamophobia in France. CNN anchors John Vose and Aisha Sissay spent several minutes grilling their guest on the role of the Muslim community in the Paris attacks.
It seems to me that this was a pretty big plan. Surely someone beyond the 7 guys who have been killed over the last 48 hours would have to have known something, and that was probably within the Muslim community, but yet no one said anything.
Sir, the Muslim community has nothing to do with these guys. Nothing. We cannot justify ourselves for the actions of someone who just claims to be Muslim. Our secret services knew about these guys, and again, just like during the January attacks, it turned out they were all on a blacklist somewhere, somehow on a desk. So right now we can't take responsibility for anything. Right now, what these terrorists are blaming us for is belonging to the French nation and
Sure. Sorry to interrupt, yes, but what is the responsibility within the Muslim community to identify what is happening within their own ranks when it comes to people who are obviously training and preparing to carry out mass murder?
No, sir. No. They were not from our ranks. If they were trained abroad. And what these terrorists are blaming our country for is for its failed foreign policy.
When the interview concluded with Louati, the anchors, John Vose and Aisha Sissay, had this discussion.
I'm yet to hear, the condemnation from the Muslim community on this. But
I mean, again, the point he's making is it's not our fault, but the fact of the matter is when these things happen, the finger of blame is pointed at the Muslim community, and so you have to be preemptive. It's coming from the community. You've got to take a standard.
The word responsibility comes to mind.
It just comes to mind. You can't shirk that.
That was CNN. Glenn Greenwald, you're a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Can you talk about what they said and how they treated this Muslim civil rights activist in Paris?
Honestly, that interview is so despicable that it almost leaves me speechless. I think that's probably the 10th or 11th time I've heard it, and it's still actually hard to believe that any human beings, let alone people calling themselves journalists, would say any of the horrific things that they said. I mean, I know Yasser, and I mean, he's a civil rights activist in Paris. He's very smart, he's very educated, he's very savvy about the law and about politics. And so to go on and essentially accuse him of bearing responsibility for terrorist attacks because he's Muslim and the people who did it are Muslim, I mean, it's so reprehensible. There's so many lies that those journalists said, too.
I was thinking about after Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City building, if they had brought on white Christian male minister after minister and saying, he is from your ranks, what do you say?
Yeah, or imagine if they did a story on the Israeli who went to the gay and lesbian pride parade in Jerusalem a couple months ago and stabbed 6 people, and then every time they had a Jewish guest on, they said, why didn't you Jews, who obviously knew about this, do anything to stop it, and why aren't you as Jews condemning this and you bear responsibility? They would be fired before the interview was over. They also said that, no Muslims are condemning this, which is a total lie. Every leading Muslim organization in the West issued statements immediately condemning the Paris attacks like they always do in these cases. I wish they actually wouldn't do it because it bolsters the idea that they have the obligation. But the reality is that they did. So, I mean, that's just one small part is the lie that these journalists told. And then the other part is to say you as Muslims obviously knew about this plot and had the responsibility to stop it and yet failed to do so. All of the leading world's intelligence agencies with tens of billions of dollars and massive surveillance infrastructure had no idea about this plot, and yet they're telling Yasser Louati that he and every other Muslim in France obviously knew about it and should have stopped it and is guilty for not doing so. It's really despicable, but it's what's in the ether. It's absolutely the really scary climate that has emerged in the wake of Paris, an extremely anti-Muslim strain of animosity that we've seen historically in the past, and that is both ugly and really dangerous.
Well, Glenn Greenwald, let's go to one of the reasons that have been cited for the growth of the Islamic State, not the Muslim community in France. The Guardian reported Wednesday that 4 former Air Force drone operators have written an open letter to Barack Obama warning that the program of targeted killings by drones has become a major driving force for ISIS and other terrorist groups. They write, quote, "The innocent civilians we were killing only fueled the feelings of hatred that ignited terrorism and groups like ISIS, while also serving as a fundamental recruitment tool similar to Guantanamo Bay." Glenn Greenwald, could you respond to that?
It's amazing how we just refuse to learn this lesson. I mean, obviously, there are some differences between ISIS and al-Qaeda, but there's many, many more similarities than differences. And one of the things that we should have learned, and that a lot of people have learned, including not just left-wing activists or independent journalists, but even think tanks and even the Rumsfeld Pentagon commissioned a study finding this, that what fuels and strengthens terrorist organizations is resentment toward the United States as a result of the policies that we engage in, the actions that we engage in that part of the world. Yemen is probably the best example. If you talk to Yemenis, what they will tell you is that there was no al-Qaeda in Yemen, or very little al-Qaeda in Yemen, very weak and the presence was marginal and negligible prior to the U.S. escalating its drone campaign in 2009, 2010, and killing huge numbers of civilians, which is what drove Yemenis into the arms of al-Qaeda and strengthened al-Qaeda to become al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so, of course, you will always have violent extremists. We have them in the United States, as Amy mentioned earlier, people who are like Timothy McVeigh, anti-government extremists, or Christian extremists who kill abortion doctors, or white supremacists who go into a church in Charleston and shoot up people in a church for no reason other than hatred of their race. So you're always going to have violent extremists. You can't eliminate that. We're always going to have ISIS. You can't eliminate that. The question then becomes, how do you avoid giving them an infrastructure of support and fueling and strengthening the willingness of people to run into their arms? And so much of what we're doing, from dropping bombs on civilians in virtually, in multiple countries in that region, to pouring weapons and money into that region that end up in the hands of ISIS, is absolutely strengthening them. And as these 4 Air Force whistleblowers said this morning, the Obama drone campaign is a major recruitment tool for ISIS, because people in that region constantly see, just like we just saw in Paris, they constantly see images of dead women and children and innocent men at the hands of the United States government. And just like we have anger toward ISIS when we see that and want to do violence to them, the people in that part of the world who see images of our victims want to do that as well to us. And running into the arms of ISIS is a natural thing for them to do.
Glenn Greenwald, what about if the media did not see war as an option? So, for example, you have these horrific attacks in Paris. The immediate response is the pummeling of Raqqa. Yes, they say it's the headquarters of the Islamic State. It's got hundreds of thousands of civilians. France pummels it. The U.S. pummels it. Russia pummels it. Where are the questions in the media about the civilian death toll? And then the people, of course, fleeing that hellhole will be stopped from resettling anywhere, as we see from the United States to Europe. So that question of broadening the discussion to peaceful options, clearly war has not worked for well over 14 years now. Taliban controls more of Afghanistan than it did before the U.S. invaded.
I mean, Afghanistan is the perfect example, Amy, which is, if you go back and listen to what American political leaders in both parties and journalists and pretty much the entire country, I mean, 90% of the American population supported the war in Afghanistan. I mean, there were a good number of people who didn't, but overwhelmingly people did. What everybody was saying at that time was they were speaking out of rage and anger and hatred and disgust for the Taliban, for their involvement or perceived involvement or responsibility for the 9/11 attacks. And the idea was, we're going to go to Afghanistan and we're going to obliterate the Taliban. We're going to basically just bomb them out of existence. And the Bush administration had a completely free hand, cheered on by the media and the overwhelming majority of the American population, to do exactly that. And they tried. And yet, as you just said, 13 years later, the Taliban is stronger than ever, because you cannot do that. All you end up doing is turning the people of Afghanistan against you and therefore driving them into the arms of the Taliban. We just won't learn that lesson. And the reason we won't learn that lesson is twofold. Number one is a lot of what is being stoked are really potent instincts in human nature. Our tribalistic instinct, our desire for vengeance, our desire to otherize people and then destroy them. And so when you see carnage in Paris, I'm sure it's true for you, I know it's true for me, all of us have that impulse to say the people who did this are monsters and we want to destroy them. But we, as human beings, have not only impulse, we also have reason. And the purpose of our reason is to control our instincts and impulses. We don't just act by instinct and impulse. If we did, we'd be the lowest level animals. But the media is trying to stoke that id part of our brain, and so is the government, to just focus on vengeance and focus on a desire to obliterate, even when it's not in our interest to do so. And then the second reason is, the American media benefits immensely from war. Huge number of people watch CNN and MSNBC when there are wars. They get to go to war zones and dress up as soldiers, with camouflage flags, and they embed with the American media. It's exciting for them. They win awards as part of their career. They feel nationalistic. They feel like they have purpose. Telling people that they're part of a civilization war and fighting for freedom and democracy, that makes people feel really good, especially journalists. And so journalists are hungry for war. You could basically see them drooling in that press conference they did with Obama a few days ago, where they tried to badger him into sending ground troops into Syria. So all of these emotions and all of these instincts and all of these really ignominious impulses are combining into this really toxic brew that we've seen many times in the U.S. over the last several, since 9/11, but I don't think we have seen it quite as potently since 2002 or 2003, and it's amazing to watch everything just repeat itself.
Just to clarify, on the issue of the Taliban, the Taliban control more of the country now than right after the U.S. invaded, when supposedly the U.S. was going to take charge and force the Taliban out. Nermeen.
Yeah, Glenn Greenwald, talking about the increasing militarization of the conflict, you've spoken of the effects of pouring so many weapons into the region. And your recent article, one of your recent articles, is headlined "Stock Prices of Weapons Manufacturers Soaring Since the Paris Attack." So could you talk about what you found? What arms manufacturers and where are increasing their arms sales?
It was amazing. The Paris attacks happened on last Friday night. So the markets obviously weren't open over the weekend. They opened first thing in the morning, Monday. Instantly, if you look at the charts of the stock prices of the leading weapons manufacturers, not only in the United States, but also in France, there was a massive leap the minute the markets opened. It was like investors were frothing at the mouth to buy the stock of the leading arms manufacturers, such as Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and then in France, the leading one is Thales, is the French pronunciation, I believe. And in each case, you see this straight up vertical line beginning right at the beginning of the day, and then throughout the day the stock prices continue to increase from anywhere to 3 to 5 to 6%, and then the following day in a lot of cases it continued, even as the rest of the market was basically flat or up very, very slightly. There was a huge gap between the weapons manufacturers' stock prices and the rest of the market, and the reason is obvious, which is every time there's a terrorist attack, Western leaders exploit that attack to do more war, as Amy was just saying, which in turn means they transfer huge amounts of American taxpayer money and the taxpayer money in France and Great Britain to these corporations that sell arms. And so investors are fully aware that the main people who are going to benefit from this escalation as a result of Paris are not the American people or the people of the West, certainly not the people of Syria. It's essentially the military industrial complex that is going to profit greatly.
You talk about the weapons manufacturers. What about the countries? If you can, we can end on Saudi Arabia, and we only have 30 seconds. U.S. just signing one massive arms deal after another with Saudi Arabia.
It's the weirdest part of the war on terror, which is that there's one country basically most identified with the 9/11 attacks and the ideology that drove it, and that happens to be the second closest ally of the United States in that region, which is Saudi Arabia. And they not only were responsible for lots of parts of al-Qaeda, but are funding in lots of different ways ISIS as well, and yet we continue to hug them while waging war in countries that have never had anything to do with attacks on our country.
Glenn Greenwald, we want to thank you for being with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. We will link to your pieces at The Intercept, among them New York Times editorial slams disgraceful CIA exploitation of Paris attacks, but submissive media role is key.